Note: the following episode contains discussion of sexual harassment and abuse. Listener discretion is advised. In 1975, former University of Michigan wrestler Ted DeLuca accused former UM doctor Robert E. Anderson of sexual abuse in a letter to the university, but this letter was dismissed. In February 2020, DeLuca made his allegations against Anderson public, accusing the doctor of sexually abusing patients during his time at the university in roles including director of the University Health Service, team physician for the athletic department, and a clinical instructor at the university's medical school. After a 2021 independent investigation by Wilmer Hale, about 1,050 people, the large majority of whom were male and of color, had accused Anderson of sexual abuse during his 40-year tenure at the university. After a months-long protest, which is now referred to as the Hail to the Victims campaign outside of the President's House on South University Avenue, the university reached a $490 million settlement agreement with the plaintiffs in January 2022. In this week's episode, we sit down for a roundtable with managing Focal Point editor Sophia Lehrbaum and Focal Point investigative reporters Reva, Lalwani, and Nirali Patel to discuss their latest piece following up on the settlement paid to victims of the Anderson case. You're listening to The Daily Weekly. I'm your host, Quinn Murphy. Stay tuned. So just to start off, let's have you all walk the listeners through this article. What's the story here?
Well, a lot of reporting has been done on Dr. Anderson and this case by the Daily and other news outlets, but now we're trying to follow up with the survivors and where they are after this mass tort case has kind of come to a close. And our story is trying to follow 5 survivors and get their stories along with a plethora of background sources and legal sources in order to guide us through the allocation process from court order all the way to them receiving the money.
Yeah, and I think a big part of our piece is that this money does not mean closure for survivors. It doesn't mean that this is over or that this is resolved. And we really wanted to communicate the nuances of these survivors' lived experiences and show that because, the media cycle has moved on and we want to make sure that they're still made important in the public.
So you mentioned in the story some legal documents like the Settlement Allocation Methodology Protocol. Can you describe this and how you used it in your reporting?
Yeah, so the Settlement Allocation Methodology Protocol document essentially uses a numerical system to quantify the abuse of survivors for the purposes of distributing settlement money. So it uses a point system and it awards points on the basis of, categories such as categories of abuse, which are awarded a baseline amount. So, for example, they separate, if there was fondling versus penetration of any kind. So these categories of abuse will be awarded different baseline amounts. And then points are added in addition to these baseline amounts in order to essentially equal a sum of money at the end of this equation that they have laid out in this document. Which we found particularly shocking, and especially the fact that this is so commonplace in mass tort cases. This is not out of the ordinary. We want people to kind of understand that this is used in most sexual, I can't say all, but I would presume most sexual abuse mass tort cases function this way.
Were there any categories within that formula that you all found particularly interesting or shocking?
Yeah, actually, I sat down with Professor Elizabeth Birch, who is who's a professional expert on mass tort dealings, and something she mentioned was the extraordinary circumstances section. And the example she gave me, which I think would be great to elucidate here, was if you, for example, are on a plane next to your spouse and they pass away, you now have to, fly for the next several hours next to the corpse of your dead spouse. And that would qualify maybe as special extraordinary circumstances. And it's kind of like that survived trauma afterwards that will go to the family of the survivor. And it really does have to be an extraordinary circumstance in order for a survivor to qualify for that fund.
And how would that I know I'm going a little off the cuff here, but how would that apply to the survivors of the Anderson case?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I think the way I would see it is if there was extenuating trauma for a survivor or for their family in a way that would cause, I would say, like mental distress to the extent of like needing further help outside of like what could be provided by the settlement fund. That's why it's there. Honestly, none of the survivors that we spoke to gave us an indication of them needing the extraordinary circumstances fund. So I don't have like a specific example for you, but I don't know if you guys have a better idea of what that might qualify or look like for survivors in the Anderson case.
Yeah, I think it's specifically instances that are not fully captured, like trauma that is so significant that it cannot be fully captured by the rest of the categories within the settlement. So yeah, I think the example of like the airplane and sitting next to a spouse that has like died next to you is a really good example of that. So I'm not exactly sure how that would translate to the Anderson case, but definitely a situation where there is some sort of like extenuating trauma that is difficult to capture otherwise.
So just to make sure I'm getting this clear, with the example of the sitting next to your dead spouse on a plane, the extenuating circumstance is not only has your spouse just died, but now you have to just sit next to their corpse instead of seeking, like calling an ambulance or a funeral home or something like that.
Yeah, and in this specific instance, you would be on an airplane, so it would be like almost an inability to not sit next to your dead spouse, like a circumstance that forces you to endure trauma in a way that is unavoidable. I think is like the takeaway for me.
Okay, awesome. Are there any other categories that you guys found interesting?
Yeah, so one particular category that we found interesting was the common benefits category, where basically, like, you know, if there were survivors that had, spoken to the press or, had done something that could really help shed light to what was happening at the university with the Anderson sexual assault cases, that kind of constitutes as like, just a common benefit for everybody and all the plaintiffs and, everyone, because that really helped everybody in the settlement case that really just, would be considered as a point for the common benefits.
So if you spoke out about this more, you got paid more money from the settlement?
Yes. I guess like the one thing is that not everybody kind of like received points from the common benefits category because when we were speaking to some of the survivors, we did learn about how sometimes, it can, speaking about trauma can be a little bit, difficult to do. And it takes a lot of courage to be doing that. And, not everyone would be able to speak to the press, for example. So, but because there were people out there who did, it really did help make a difference and help shed awareness to the cause.
I know you guys have been working on this story since August 2023. At the time of recording, it is April 2024. Can you tell us about the process of your investigation?
Yeah, so we first began with having some extensive research about like the Anderson case and what led up to the Anderson settlement. And we kind of like looked through some past documents, past timelines, and like articles that could really help us build a better contextual understanding of this whole topic deeply and how people were like affected and for how long this has been going on. And then from there, we just started building more ideas for what kind of direction our article could take.
I guess the next part of this was like the part that required the most sensitivity on our part, which was reaching out to survivors and conducting interviews with them. Obviously, this is a case that required a lot of sensitivity, and that meant reaching out to survivors multiple times maybe in order to, try and figure out if they were willing to speak with us in the first place, and knowing when to back off. And then after you've conducted the off and on record portions, making sure you're keeping up communication with them and speaking with them on a pretty regular basis to let them know how the story's coming. Because I think a lot of them have anxiety over how the press has depicted them previously and want to know what we're up to and what we're doing. And our sources were really, really helpful when it came to giving us documents and more. So a lot of that was us keeping a really good rapport with them and keeping them in the loop about things.
Then we sort of transcribe the interviews, we organize them, and this is a part that's kind of like a puzzle for us to put together, is where do all the moving pieces fit? Because it isn't a stagnant process. There is constant movement with these stories. There's new comments that we're receiving. With previous cases, we've had survivors back out. We've had new survivors come on record with like previous focal point reporting. And so you're always keeping in mind that it needs to be a very fluid process when you're writing the piece. And so when you're putting all the pieces together to construct a narrative, we went through weeks of editing, we started with one piece that, focused a little bit more on like the university's legal strategy, which was something we realized did not directly affect survivors. And we wanted to really make this a survivor-centered piece. So then we ended up at a very different place where our piece is very much survivor-centered and focused on the stories of the lived realities of these survivors, which we believe is the most important part of the piece.
So I guess this kind of goes off of that, but over these months, what was the most impactful part of the process for each of you?
I could start. I think for me, it was really seeing the resilience that a lot of the survivors that I spoke to had, and just seeing how for a lot of them, it was something that would really touch them, and having the opportunity to sit there and really offer a comforting environment for them to share their experiences, and fostering that type of empathy for them during the interview was something that I felt was really impactful to me. And I got to really learn about, a lot more about the impact of sexual violence, and also what it means to really hold situations or institutions accountable.
I guess kind of on a similar note, I think for me it was kind of seeing how grateful our survivors were to us. Mm-hmm. I was so grateful to them, but seeing that kind of reflected back at us, and they were so happy that we were telling their stories and giving them the time and appreciation that it takes to tell this long and this complicated of a story. I remember getting a text from one of my sources a few weeks ago, and he was just like, "Thank you so much for the time that you've given me, and like I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing." And it's really like validating to know that what we're doing is not just for this community or just for us as writers, but also for the people whose stories we're telling.
Absolutely. I think that kind of translates to what the most impactful part of this process was. It wasn't in a good way. Seeing how formulaic the legal system makes abuse, seeing how they translate a lived experience into numbers, something that is impossible to quantify with numbers, something that our legal experts in this piece, kind of lament over, is like, this is the only way the system knows how to work. And at the same time, how are we supposed to do this? How are we supposed to quantify abuse in this way? And just knowing that this is how it works with every sexual abuse mass tort case that we understand. I mean, we did a lot of research before we published this piece. We looked at, the Larry Nasser settlement, and they had a very similar settlement allocation process. We looked at the Flint water crisis. They had a similar settlement allocation process. And just taking lived experiences and making them numbers, it just doesn't feel right. It feels very wrong, especially when you speak to the survivors and you hear their stories. So I would say that impacted me the most, and it made me angry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm kind of at a loss for words there. But you talked about changing up the way that you were writing and the angle you were taking on this. How did you turn this investigation, looking at just, this, what appears to be standard legal process, and turn it into a story?
Yeah, I think a big piece of this for us was just seeing how the media cycle jumped on this story when they were when the Hail to the Victims campaign was protesting in front of the president's house, seeing how much media attention it was getting, and then all of a sudden to see that completely fade away. Survivors are still living with this trauma every single day of their lives. This is not just a story to them that they can read in CNN. This is their life. And we really wanted to show what happened after, almost to serve as a reminder that these people are still here and they're a part of our community and they deserve our continued attention, not just when it's convenient for us to pay attention, not when it's comfortable for us to pay attention. I would say that was a big motivation for looking into the settlement process and turning it into something as, how does this affect survivors?
I think I'd also really quickly add on that our survivors guided a lot of this story, and hearing what it was that they were upset about or frustrated with led us to the place that the story is at right now.
You guys have talked a lot about how money cannot solve this, and it's not a single media cycle coming in. I know I'm a sophomore right now, and I had only the faintest idea even of this case up until very recently. So I think your work is incredibly important, bringing this back into the public's light, the public's mind, the community's mind, because it's not just a blip for them. But what do you want readers and listeners to take away from this story?
I guess something I was thinking about was how this entire settlement process was fully legal. All of it was legal. Sophia already spoke on this a little bit, but this formulaic system that may not have the correct tools to turn lived experience into an end result, it's completely legal. And what's important to note with that is that the system is enabling re-traumatization, and the story doesn't end with the court decision, as we've already said multiple times at this point. But I think that's what I want readers to take away. Just because a system is as it is, doesn't mean that, it's the best way to go about something. And I don't mean to say that one of us is about to go take up a torch and fight the entire legal system. But it's important to know that the system that we live in has room to grow.
I think something that's really important for readers to remember is that Anderson specifically targeted male athletes who had scholarships that renewed annually. These were marginalized populations. They were, a majority of them were men of color, low income student athletes that required scholarships to go to Michigan. And if they lost their scholarship, God forbid they spoke out. If you lose your scholarship, then what? How do you keep going to the University of Michigan if you're low income and this pays for your education? So I think that is a really important nuance of the power dynamic that was going on with Anderson that people need to remember for sure.
And I think another takeaway is that, all survivor experiences are not monolithic, and there's so many nuances to it. And that, all the perspectives that people have are absolutely valid, and it's important to hear their stories and what improvements we can make within a system, whether they're, university at a university level or even beyond legally.
Thank you so much, guys, for giving us this insight into the story and your writing process. Is there anything else you want to add? Is there anything else you think listeners should know?
I think, to be like nerdy for a second, I don't think people realize how much of this information is public and publicly available. On Focal Point, we use something called Boolean search operators, which is like sophisticated is a little bit of a reach, but more sophisticated ways of looking up things on Google in order to comb sites for particular documents that contain particular keywords. So I think just being kind of curious about what's out there and like not being afraid to like do a little bit of digging and research. You would be surprised how much you can find on Google. You would be very surprised. That curiosity I think is really important.
I don't know if any of the survivors we actually interviewed would be like watching this, but I want to thank them for their involvement in our story, and telling their story once again. We're like one of the many who have covered this piece, and it's an honor to have spoken with each and every one of them for this story.
This episode of The Daily Weekly was produced by managing podcast editors Sneha Dundapani and Riley Stipe, executive producer Quinn Murphy, Focal Point managing editor Sophia Lehrbaum, and Focal Point investigative reporters Reva, Lalwani, and Nirali Patel. The Daily Weekly's theme song is produced by Gibson Gillette Barons. As always, thank you for listening.